I'm Eve Harlan, 39 years old, and I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. My father was a master sergeant in the 5th Special Forces Group, 26 years of service, and when he died, I flew home to Black Mountain, North Carolina, to bury him. And at the graveside, in front of 30 people who came to pay their respects, my stepmother stood across his casket and told the deputy to arrest me. She had forged documents, she had a plan. What she didn't have was the letter my father quietly filed in 3 separate locations, 11 months before he died. Before I get into what happened, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to hold your ground when someone assumed you wouldn't, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. What comes next might surprise you. My father's hands were the first thing I understood about work. He had the hands of a man who spent 30 years doing things that mattered and never talked about them afterward. Wide, capable hands with calluses along the base of every finger that never fully softened, even after he retired. I was 4 years old the first time I remember watching him work. He was in the garage behind our house in Black Mountain, North Carolina, bent over a neighbor's pickup truck with the hood up and the timing belt spread in pieces across a clean shop rag beside him. He narrated what he was doing in a steady, even voice, as if I were a colleague who had asked to observe, rather than a 4-year-old in overalls who could barely reach the lip of the engine bay. He explained what a timing belt does. He explained what happens to an engine when it fails. He explained how to read the residue and wear a pattern on the old belt to determine whether the failure had been sudden or had been building for months before the final snap. He treated that explanation as important. He treated me as someone capable of understanding it. I didn't understand most of it. Yeah, I was 4. But I understood the tone, precise, patient, thorough, entirely without condescension, and I would carry that tone into every professional situation I faced for the next 35 years. Every briefing I delivered to a room full of officers who outranked me. Every time I walked a junior analyst through a methodology they were struggling with. Every time I had to explain something complicated to someone who needed it to be clear. The tone was his, and I borrowed it without ever consciously knowing I was borrowing it. And it was decades before I traced it back to that garage and that afternoon and his hands. His name was Joseph Allen Harlan. He was born in Asheville, North Carolina, in 1952, the second of 4 children in a family that fixed things for a living. His father worked at a textile mill outside of town, and his mother took in mending and kept a vegetable garden large enough to feed the neighborhood through autumn. Nobody in that family had attended college, but they were precise people in the most practical sense, people who understood that the difference between something working and something failing is almost always attention, applied consistently before the damage becomes permanent. He enlisted in the United States Army at 19 in 1971 and spent the next 26 years doing work he could rarely describe in civilian terms and wouldn't have tried to describe anyway. He completed the Special Forces qualification course at Fort Bragg in 1975 and spent most of his career with the 5th Special Forces Group, rotating through assignments in locations he referred to in the most general terms, or not at all. He retired in 1997 as a Master Sergeant, an E8, with the kind of service record that people who understand what it represents go quiet about, and the kind that people who don't tend to scroll past without registering. After his retirement in 1997, he moved the family to Black Mountain permanently, and he settled into the community in the way of a man who has been useful in the world and intends to continue being useful. He fixed neighbors' vehicles on weekends and charged nothing for the labor. He served on the church's Veterans Outreach Committee and showed up when the committee asked for volunteers. He kept a garden in the back that produced more vegetables than the household needed, which meant the neighbors got the surplus, which meant everyone liked him somewhat more than they would have otherwise, which was not, I think, a calculation he made consciously, but was simply a byproduct of being the kind of person who grows more than he needs and shares the rest. He drove the same used pickup truck for 9 years. He maintained the house with the precise, consistent attention of someone who understood that regular maintenance is always cheaper than emergency repair, not in dollars, but in time, which is the resource he actually tracked. He kept his retirement shadow box on the living room shelf, where guests could see it if they looked, but he never directed anyone's attention toward it and would change the subject if someone asked about his service with any real specificity. He was not modest in the way of someone secretly hoping to be pressed. He was private in the way of someone who had genuinely concluded that most of what he had done was not his to discuss. I was born in Black Mountain in 1986, his only child. My mother, Patricia, had been teaching elementary school near Fort Bragg when they met in 1984. She was warm and perceptive and could read a room in 30 seconds with an accuracy that came from 19 years of teaching children who hadn't yet learned to lie convincingly. She had calibrated her ability to detect performance versus authenticity on several thousand third graders, and the skill transferred to adults without any loss of precision. She taught school in Buncombe County for 19 years and grew a garden in the backyard and laughed easily at things she genuinely found funny rather than at things that were supposed to be funny, which I recognized early as a meaningful distinction. She and my father were the only model of a functional partnership I have ever trusted as a genuine template, not because their marriage was visibly romantic, but because it was consistent and honest and never required either of them to be someone they weren't. She died of pancreatic cancer in January of 2014 at 56 years old. The diagnosis came in October of 2013. She was gone in January. 3 months, which is both a long time and not nearly long enough depending on what you're measuring. There was nothing orderly about those 3 months, despite everything my father and I did to treat the situation as something that could be managed with sufficient organization and preparation. And I came home on emergency leave from Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where I was serving as a major in Air Force intelligence. And my father and I moved through the arrangements with the quiet efficiency of two people who share the same instinct under pressure. Identify the next required thing, do it, move to the next one. We went to the funeral home together, we spoke with the director, we completed the paperwork, we coordinated with the cemetery, we handled the notifications and the legal documents and the coordination with her school, which sent flowers and a card signed by every teacher in the building. We moved through those days without falling apart, which I know some people read as coldness, and which was actually the opposite. It was the most love I knew how to demonstrate, at a moment when demonstration was the only thing I had the capacity for. On the third night, very late, past midnight, he made 2 cups of coffee without asking and put one in front of me at the kitchen table and sat across from me. We stayed there for a long time. He said eventually, "I'm glad you're still in." He meant the Air Force. He also meant something much larger, something about remaining intact when the fixed point of your world disappears, about continuing to do purposeful work when grief is the only work that feels available. I understood both meanings simultaneously, and neither of us needed to confirm that understanding aloud. We finished the coffee, we went to bed. In the morning we handled the next required things. I had commissioned in May of 2008 a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force Intelligence Branch. He drove 6 hours from Black Mountain to Raleigh for the commissioning ceremony without telling me he was coming. I found him afterward, standing at the back of the hall against the wall, not in the reserved family seating section where I had placed a chair with his name on it. The chair was empty, and he was 20 feet away, comfortable in a room where he had no official role, wearing his good slacks and a pressed button-down and looking entirely at ease. He shook my hand before he hugged me. A full handshake, deliberate, both of us facing each other, the kind that is a complete statement. "You outrank me now," he said. I told him he had more time in grade. He considered this and agreed it was technically true, and the way he said it contained more pride than most people manage to express in a lifetime of trying. We talked every Sunday for the 15 years that followed my commissioning, 45 minutes give or take on a cadence he maintained without fail. For a long time, I assumed this was simply his preferred rhythm for conversation, that 45 minutes was the amount of a Sunday afternoon he chose to allocate to the phone. I discovered years later, among his belongings in the house, a stack of physical therapy appointment cards going back to 2011, all scheduled for Sunday afternoons, all with a handwritten note in the margin. "Call Eve, after." He had been calling me the moment each session ended because 45 minutes was what the physical therapist had available before the next patient. He structured his generosity around what he could genuinely give rather than what he wished he could give. I find this quality admirable in a way that I cannot fully put into words, which is interesting because I spend my professional life putting things into words. We talked about my work in the approximate terms I was permitted to use: first lieutenant, captain, major, various assignments I could describe in general outlines, if not specific details. He understood, from his own career, exactly where the lines were and never asked me to cross them. He asked precise questions about things I could answer. He listened to what I said and formed assessments he either kept to himself or offered when they were relevant. He never offered unsolicited advice about my career. He never suggested I should be doing something other than what I was doing. The closest he ever came was once, in a 2012 call after I mentioned a particularly difficult review process, when he said, "Just keep doing the work. The people who do the work eventually become impossible to ignore." Then he moved on to something else, and that was the end of that. These calls were not sentimental in their texture. There were no extended declarations of feeling or elaborate processing of emotion. They were reliable in the way that genuinely reliable things are, present every week without exception, consistent in their quality, never treated as optional by either of us. The consistency was the message. It said, "I will be here at this time, on this day, every week, for as long as we both can manage it." That promise was kept for 15 years. The only thing that ended it was him dying. I met Maribel Cruz in December of 2017 at the Black Mountain House over Christmas. My father had mentioned her in several prior Sunday calls, someone he had encountered at a church gathering near Asheville, organized and reliable and present in the way that community-minded people are present. She was 54 years old when I met her, from Greensboro originally, precisely dressed in the way of someone who has given careful thought to presentation as a form of communication. She had done her research before my arrival. She knew the 5th Special Forces Group and could name the base he had retired from and referenced his career with what sounded like genuine respect. She asked about my work in terms vague enough to communicate consideration without betraying ignorance. I noted her preparation and told myself it was a good sign. I also noticed somewhere in the part of my mind I was not yet listening to that her references to his career felt practiced rather than arrived at, like someone who had identified the correct responses in advance and memorized them. I filed this observation in the part of my mind where I kept things I was not yet ready to examine, and I left it there for longer than I should have. I called him the following Sunday as usual, and we spoke for 22 minutes. He mentioned Christmas, mentioned the weather, mentioned a church event in January. He did not mention the card. I did not mention the card. Neither of us acknowledged the obvious reason why I was not in the photograph or why my name was not in the caption. There are several possible interpretations for why he didn't raise it. That he did not know it had been sent, that he had been told I was unavailable for the photo session, or that some compromise had been offered to him that he accepted without examining closely because he was by 2021 already somewhat less sharp at the edges than the man I had grown up with. Not dramatically, nothing you would notice if you hadn't known him for 35 years, but enough that I had begun silently tracking it in the way I track things that might be significant. He was 70, and Maribel had been in the house for 3 years by that point. I kept the card in the back drawer and said nothing about it. I increased the frequency of my calls from once a week to twice a week for a period in the spring of 2022. He answered the second calls reliably, and they were fine, and I told myself the situation was fine, and I believed enough of that to continue operating as if it were true. This is what it looks like when someone is being precise and careful. Not ignorant, just choosing the available interpretation that costs the least to maintain while continuing to function and continuing to show up. The alternative, to name the thing I was observing, would have required me to be wrong in a way that hurt him, and I wasn't ready to pay that cost yet. They married in March of 2018 at a small ceremony outside Asheville. I stood beside my father during the exchange of vows. He held Maribel's hands with the full, careful attention he gave things that genuinely mattered to him. Completely present, nothing withheld, and his expression was the expression of a man who has decided something and is at peace with having decided it. I watched his face through the ceremony and let myself be convinced by what I saw. I wanted him to be settled. I had wanted him to be settled since my mother died 4 years earlier, and I arranged my interpretation of everything that followed around that want for longer than I should have. That is not an excuse. It is an accurate description of a failure of observation. The changes came over the years that followed, and they were calibrated. They were not dramatic enough to name clearly at any single moment. Birthday cards I sent arrived late and then stopped being mentioned in our calls. The Sunday calls shortened over time, 35 minutes, then 30, then 20. My father's voice on the phone began carrying a quality I recognized from exactly one professional context. Someone speaking with awareness that the conversation is being monitored, slightly more careful than usual, slightly more abbreviated. In late 2020, a Sunday call ended at 18 minutes when Maribel's voice came through the background announcing that guests had arrived. And my father wrapped up with a politeness that was not quite himself, not cold, just slightly managed, and I sat with the phone after he hung up and told myself there was a charitable interpretation available, and I took it because I wanted to. In 2021, Maribel sent a family Christmas card featuring a photograph of herself, Joseph, and her adult daughter Celeste, captioned "Our Family" in script beneath the image. I was not in the photograph. My name was not in the caption. The card arrived at Wright-Patterson in January of 2022, a month after it was mailed, behind a piece of junk mail in my base housing mailbox. I held it in my hands and looked at it for a while. Then I placed it in the back drawer of my desk, where I had begun, without fully consciously acknowledging what I was doing, to file things that might matter later. I would learn during the forensic accounting process that by the fall of 2019, Maribel had been intercepting my mail. Letters and cards I sent to the house were signed for at the door and placed in a drawer in her nightstand before my father saw them. A handwritten note I sent in late 2019, after a difficult assignment, the kind of letter I only wrote to him, in a register I reserved for things too important for the phone, sat in that drawer for 6 years. He did not know it existed. He thought I had stopped writing. He did not raise the matter in our calls because he was managing the household with care, and because he interpreted my silence as natural drift rather than manufactured distance. The gap between what he thought was happening and what was actually happening was something Maribel built deliberately over years, and neither of us knew it was built. I was assigned to the National Air and Space Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, in 2023, serving as a senior intelligence officer. NASIC produces assessments on foreign aerospace and space systems. It is technical, demanding work that requires sustained concentration and extended precision. And I was suited to it in the way that someone is suited to work that matches how they were raised to think. In our Sunday calls during those years, my father and I talked around the edges of things we couldn't name, and I filled in the gaps between what he said and what I needed to believe, because I wanted him to be settled and he was managing his situation without requiring me to manage it for him. In November of 2024, he called me on a Sunday at the usual time and told me he had been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. He delivered the information directly: the diagnosis date, the oncologist's name, the prognosis. He had been tracking the symptoms for several months before the appointment, which was entirely consistent with how he approached every situation he found himself in. He told me not to come home early. He said he didn't want me watching him get smaller. That was, I believe, the most Green Beret thing he ever said to me, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. I asked what he needed from me. He said he needed me to keep working. I asked if there was anything he wanted me to know. He gave me Robert Yancey's name, an attorney in Waynesville, North Carolina, and told me to call him when the time came. I wrote the name down, confirmed the spelling, and did not press for more, because I understood what was being communicated, and the understanding was enough. He died at home in Black Mountain on June 7th, 2025, at 73 years old. Colonel Dana Reeves came to my office in person to tell me. She closed the door behind her before she spoke, which is not the protocol for notifications at my level, and which told me that she had decided this required more than protocol. I was grateful for the decision. I made the call to the funeral home from the NASIC parking lot, because the number had been in my phone since November, and because I wanted to begin the sequence of required actions without losing time. I did not cry in the parking lot. I went back inside, briefed my deputy on the project handoff, submitted emergency leave, and was in my car before the duty day ended. I drove south on I-75 through the night, stopping once in West Virginia at a highway rest area at around 3 a.m. I stood outside for a few minutes in the cool mountain air, the Appalachians' dark shapes against a darker sky on both sides of the highway, and then got back in the car. I reviewed in my head everything I had. Robert Yancey in Waynesville. A letter I hadn't read yet. The funeral home's standing instructions, which I had confirmed in a call in April when my father's condition had begun to decline more rapidly. My father's entire service record, scanned and saved in 3 separate locations, on 2 devices, and 1 cloud backup, because he raised me to keep records and I had maintained the habit without needing to think about it. The graveside service was set for June 12th at Western Carolina State Veterans Cemetery in Black Mountain. I drove to the house the night before and slept in my old room, which Maribel had converted to a sewing room, but which still held my childhood dresser in the corner, and the same ceiling I had looked at for the first 18 years of my life. I woke at 5 in the morning, dressed in my Air Force service dress, the dark blue coat with the silver oak leaf clusters on both shoulders, and 3 rows of ribbons above the left breast pocket, pressed and entirely correct, and drove to the cemetery in the early morning light. I wore the uniform because my father was a master sergeant in the United States Army Special Forces, and he had earned a flag through 26 years of work that most people would never know enough about to evaluate. And I was not going to arrive at his burial in anything that communicated anything less than the full weight of what he had given and who he was. The morning was warm and completely clear. The Blue Ridge was visible over the tree line beyond the cemetery fence, the whole ridge in full June, green and enormous in the early light. The kind of morning the mountains there put on in summer that looks nearly manufactured in its quality. A 6-person honor guard had come from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. 6 airmen in dress blues with the precision that the Air Force Honor Guard trains for, and that, when executed correctly, creates a specific kind of composed gravity in the space around it. Master Sergeant David Calloway was the NCOIC, a tall man in white gloves who moved with the bearing of someone who has performed this ceremony hundreds of times and has never permitted that repetition to become routine. I noticed this about him before he said a word. About 30 people stood at the grave. Joseph's church community from Asheville, men and women in their 50s and 60s, who had known him as a neighbor, a committee member, a man who showed up for things and did not make a production of having shown up. 2 of Maribel's adult relatives standing close beside her on the far side of the casket, and 4 retired soldiers in their late 60s and early 70s who had driven in from across the Carolinas without being asked, men from the 5th SFG days who had been notified through the veterans community and came because that was what those men did for each other. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them in the way of men who spent 30 years standing at attention and never entirely lost the posture. The American flag was folded and resting on the casket. I stood opposite Maribel across the casket. The flag moved once when the breeze came through. The chaplain was speaking. I was watching the flag when Maribel stood up. She was holding a sheaf of papers, a forged power of attorney purporting to grant her exclusive authority over all funeral and estate decisions, prepared through a contact of her daughter's, stamped with a notary seal that authentication review would subsequently confirm was fraudulent. Deputy Warren Hicks of Burke County stood in plainclothes at the edge of the group on her right, having been engaged by Maribel under a characterization of the situation that had no relationship to what was actually occurring. She turned from the chaplain, looked across the open casket, directly at me, and said 2 words at full volume. "Cuff her!" Then louder, when no one moved. "Cuff her! She has no right to be here. I have the documents. Get her away from this grave." The chaplain stopped mid-sentence. Every person at the graveside went still in the way people go still when something happens that nothing in the surrounding context has prepared them for. Deputy Hicks stepped forward, his right hand moved toward his belt. I stood at attention, hands at my sides, chin level, eyes on the flag on the casket, not performing composure. Because my father was in that casket, and the flag above him had earned his name, and he had spent my entire childhood teaching me to hold my position when I was right. And I was right, and I was not going to move. Master Sergeant David Calloway stepped out of the formation and covered the distance between the honor guard and the deputy before the deputy had taken 2 full steps. He raised his right hand, one white-gloved hand, open, held at shoulder height, not threateningly, simply as the clearest possible instruction to stop. He addressed Deputy Hicks by title in a level and entirely unhurried voice. "Officer, this is Lieutenant Colonel Eve Harlan, United States Air Force. The flag is hers, per her father's written instruction, filed with this funeral home and with the Army Casualty Office at the Human Resources Command at Fort Knox. I have the documentation." He reached into the left breast pocket of his service coat and produced a folded document. The funeral home director had been notified in advance by Robert Yancey's office that a contested next-of-kin situation was possible, and had included a copy of my father's notarized letter in the NCOIC briefing packet as a standard precautionary measure. Calloway had known before he arrived what he might be called upon to do. He was prepared. Deputy Hicks took the document, and he read it. He looked at Maribel. He looked at the ground. He took one full step backward. His hand came away from his belt and stayed away. Calloway turned back to the casket. He knelt slowly with the formal and unhurried precision that comes from training and from genuine respect for what the ceremony represents, and lifted the flag with both white-gloved hands. He held it at the prescribed angle and presented it to me with both hands extended, the tri-cornered fold facing me. And he delivered the full creed in a measured voice that made it clear he had said these words hundreds of times and had never said them carelessly. On behalf of the President of the United States Air Force, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. I received it with both hands. The flag was warm from the morning sun. My father had kept this flag in a shadow box on the living room shelf for 28 years. I had looked at it every visit home, every Christmas, every time I stood in that living room trying to communicate something to him in the limited vocabulary we had developed for the things that mattered most between us. Now it was in my hands, which was where his written instructions said it was always meant to be, and where I was going to keep it. Maribel stood at the edge of the group with the papers still in her hand, and no one in the group moving to stand beside her. The silence that followed the ceremony ended was the kind of silence that means something has ended. Not with argument, not with drama, but with the complete and documented and witnessed weight of the truth. Robert Yancey called me the following morning at the house. He was measured and specific in the way of a lawyer who has handled estates for 4 decades and knows which facts matter and in what order they should be presented. The notarized letter was constructed to be legally unchallengeable. Witnessed by 2 individuals, notarized, filed simultaneously with 3 independent parties. His office, the Bryson City Funeral Home, and the Army Casualty Office at HRC, so that no single party could suppress it. The estate named Eve Harlan as sole beneficiary of all assets, personal effects, and the flag, and included a specific clause requesting formal inquiry into household finances. The forged document Maribel had presented would not survive authentication review. His office had already begun that process. My father had been explicit with Yancey about what he suspected and what he wanted. Yancey told me his exact words. "She's going to try something. I don't know what. Make sure Eve is protected." My father built a record for 11 months and gave it to a lawyer and made sure there were copies in 3 places. This is entirely consistent with every decision he ever made. I walked through the house alone that afternoon, room by room, taking my time. My mother's recipe box was in the kitchen pantry, her handwriting on the dividers, the cards inside arranged in her particular categorization system that I had grown up with and could still navigate by memory. My father's shadow box was in the back bedroom behind a lamp, moved from its original position on the living room shelf. The spare room with my childhood dresser still in the corner. The bathroom where the first aid kit had always been on the bottom shelf so a child could reach it. The workshop. In the workshop, in the last drawer of the steel tool cabinet he had owned since before my birth, bound with a single rubber band in chronological order from oldest to newest, I found every letter I had sent him in 17 years. Birthday cards, notes from overseas, handwritten pages from assignments I couldn't name but could describe in general outlines that he would have understood. He had opened every one of them. He had kept every one of them. I sat on the workshop floor with them in my lap. Cold concrete, smell of metal and old oil, and the specific mechanical smell that had been the scent of my entire childhood. And I read several of them and stayed there until the afternoon light, coming through the small garage windows, had moved all the way across the floor and begun to fade. I looked at the letters in a particular order, not chronologically, but by what I recognized on the outside of each envelope, my own handwriting at various stages of my career. The way my penmanship had changed as I moved from lieutenant to captain to major, becoming more abbreviated without losing legibility. He had opened each one carefully along the top fold, not tearing, using what I recognized from childhood as his letter opener, a flat-ended piece of military-issue brass that he had kept in the same drawer in the kitchen for as long as I could remember. The letters inside were folded back precisely the way they had arrived, nothing dog-eared, nothing marked. He had read them carefully and stored them with the same attention he applied to things that mattered. One letter, I had written it in 2016 from Ramstein, in the middle of a demanding assignment that I could not name but could describe in approximate terms, contained 2 paragraphs where I had been more direct than usual about what the work cost and what it returned. It was not a cry for help. It was an accounting. I had written it the way I write reports, clearly, without hedging, with the understanding that clarity is always kinder than approximation. Reading it back in the workshop, 12 years later, I understood something I had not understood at the time of writing. I had not sent that letter expecting a response. I had sent it because he was the only person I trusted to receive it exactly as it was written and not try to fix it. He had responded, I now remembered, with 2 sentences. One about the specific assignment I had obliquely referenced, and one about timing his garden to the frost calendar that year. He had done the correct thing, which was to receive the accounting as offered, and not transform it into a problem requiring his solution. There was a birthday card from 2010, a generic exterior that he would have bought at a hardware store in town, not caring about the exterior. Inside, in his handwriting, 1986 was the best deployment I ever came home to. He had not signed it. He hadn't needed to. Matthew Greer, the forensic accountant Robert Yancey retained in late June, completed his 3-week preliminary review in early July. $147,000 in unauthorized transfers, charges, and cash withdrawals from my father's accounts beginning in early 2019. 4 credit cards opened in his name over a 5-year period, none of which he used or likely ever saw. A Maui timeshare purchased in 2022, funded by $43,000 from his retirement account, recorded in the transaction paperwork as home improvement funds. By the date that transaction was processed, my father was using a wheelchair and had been for several months. His signature, required in 3 sections of the timeshare agreement, appeared in none of them. Maribel's handwriting appeared in all 3 sections where his signature should have been. This is a long-term, structured pattern, Greer said at the August meeting in Yancey's Waynesville office, where he presented the full findings to both of us. The activity after 2022 is distinctly more aggressive. The timeshare, the acceleration of the withdrawals, and the timing corresponds with a significant change in the subject's health indicators. The earlier phase, 2019 through 2021, was more conservative. She was building the framework. He used the word systematic twice, which in forensic accounting is a specific and considered word. I wrote down the total figure and the date ranges and each individual category of fraud, and I asked 2 clarifying questions about the timeshare transaction and the credit card applications, and then I set my pen down. I signed the cooperation agreement with the Haywood County District Attorney and the North Carolina Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit in August of 2025. At a conference table in Waynesville, in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes and produced a signed document that authorized the state to proceed. I signed it without visible emotion because my father had filed a letter requesting this inquiry, and I intended to honor that request precisely and completely. This was not an act of rage, it was an act of fidelity. My father had spent 11 months building a careful, detailed, notarized record for exactly this purpose, and I was not going to let that preparation go unused. Maribel's daughter, Celeste, called me 3 times in August. August 14th, 21st, and 28th, Tuesdays, which I eventually recognized as likely not a coincidence. The calls followed the same architecture each time. She opened with an appeal to grief as a shared condition between us, transitioned to accusation about my motivations, and closed with language that implied consequences without specifying them. I listened to the first call all the way through, taking notes on a legal pad about the specific claims she made. I did not pick up the second or third calls. I forwarded all 3 voicemails to Yancey. In late August, Celeste drove 3 hours from Charlotte to the house in Black Mountain and knocked on the door. I answered. I stood in the doorway and let her speak for approximately 4 minutes about family, about grief, about what this process was costing people. When she finished, I said, "This conversation is over. If you need to contact me, please do it through Mr. Yancey." I closed the door, not hard, just completely and finally closed. Through the fall of 2025, the investigation moved forward in the way that investigations built on solid documentation move forward. Steadily, without drama, producing paperwork and findings, and eventually consequences. Maribel retained a defense attorney in October, who released a statement to local Asheville media describing his client as a grieving widow being persecuted by an absent daughter with an agenda. I read the statement at my desk at NASIC on a Tuesday morning. I read it carefully, noted the specific claims, forwarded a summary to Yancey, and went back to the intelligence cycle I was managing. The answer to the caregiving claim was in the hospice billing records. I had paid for the hospice nurses who attended my father in his final months by direct bank transfer, starting in January of 2025. I have the invoices in 2 locations. The deposition in October was methodical and produced results. Yancey's examination proceeded carefully through the documented record. The duress claim that my father had been coerced or incompetent when he filed the letter in November failed within the first half hour when he introduced sworn affidavits from 2 of Joseph's physicians confirming full cognitive competence on the date in question. The timeshare paperwork was introduced. The in-person signature requirement was flagged and documented. The wheelchair, the date, the handwriting analysis results. Yancey called me the evening after the deposition concluded and read me the key findings in order, as he always did. I listened. I asked whether there were any procedural complications that would affect the timeline. There were not. I thanked him and hung up. The defense position, which had relied on the duress claim and the characterization of the spending as mutually agreed, did not survive contact with the record my father had spent 11 months building. I took 4 days at Thanksgiving and went to Black Mountain alone. The first 2 days I spent in the house, moving through the rooms and handling what needed handling. Some items for donation, some organizing, some simply sitting in the specific rooms and giving them the attention you give places you are leaving. On the 3rd day, I repainted the workshop. The paint was failing along the window frames, and it needed doing, and my father had planned to do it himself before the cancer made that impossible. I found his old paint can in the supply closet with the color name and formula recorded on the label in his handwriting, bought a matching gallon from the hardware store in town, and spent the morning rolling the walls and cutting in around the window frames. The work was straightforward and physical, and exactly what I needed. Halfway through the 2nd wall, I understood what I was doing. Not changing the space, maintaining it. His word. He used to say there were 2 kinds of people in the world, the ones who maintained things and the ones who waited for things to break. He said it once, without repetition, trusting that once was enough for the people he trusted to hear it. I finished the walls, cleaned the brushes and the roller, put the paint can back in the supply closet with the remaining formula recorded on the label, locked the workshop door, and drove back toward Dayton. The workshop was the same color it had always been. It would stay that way. I locked the workshop and stood in the driveway for a while before getting in the car. The house was quiet in the way of houses emptied of their daily purpose, not abandoned, just paused. The garden was dormant, but the fence he built around it in 2009 was solid and square, the posts plumb and the wire tight. The vegetable beds had been cleared and the soil turned, which meant the neighbor who had taken over the gardening in my father's last year had continued through the fall. I did not know the neighbor's name yet. I would learn it eventually and thank them. The fence would outlast all of us. In December, through Yancey's office, I learned that 3 of my father's former Special Forces teammates had been attempting to reach him since 2022. Their letters, their cards, their phone calls, none of it had come through. Maribel had managed his incoming communications with the same discipline she had applied to his finances, systematically with a clear objective. I received the contact information for the 3 men and called each of them during the week before Christmas. They were retired sergeants and warrant officers in their late 60s and early 70s, men who had known my father in the specific professional contexts I had never had access to, and what they told me filled in parts of his story I had not known were missing. The first call was Gary Sutton, a retired master sergeant who had served with my father in the early 90s and now lived in Hendersonville, 30 minutes from Black Mountain. He had tried to reach my father in 2022 by mail. Maribel had signed for the delivery. Joseph never saw the letter. Sutton talked about my father in the specific, flat way that soldiers talk about men they genuinely trusted, not sentimentally, not with performance, just the facts as he understood them and the things he wanted me to know. He told me that before Maribel cut off the contact, my father had talked about me in every conversation they had. Not mentioned me, talked about me, my specific promotions, my assignments in the approximate terms he had available. What he thought I was doing, that mattered. He knew what you did, Sutton said. He couldn't say it, and he didn't tell you because he didn't want you carrying his pride around like a weight. That was Joseph Harlan straight through. I asked Sutton how many times they had spoken after my father moved back to Black Mountain. He said every few months up through 2021, then nothing. He had assumed the silence was health-related. He had heard secondhand that my father was dealing with some things, and he had written the letter in 2022 to check in rather than to push. When it went unanswered, he had tried once more in 2023 through a mutual contact in the Special Forces community, and that inquiry had also gone nowhere. He said he had started to worry that my father simply didn't want contact anymore, that the quiet was a preference and he had respected what he thought was a preference and stayed away. I understood what that had cost him, the particular kind of loss that comes from having respected a boundary that didn't exist. He told me one more thing before we ended the call, something he said he had been thinking about how to say since he learned in August that the estate situation was being legally addressed. He said my father had sent him a letter in 2021, one of the last letters that made it through, in which Joseph had mentioned that Maribel had begun limiting how much time he spent on the phone. Not explicitly, just by scheduling things, making the house busy, creating a context in which a long call with an old teammate was always slightly inconvenient. My father had noted this in the letter without editorializing on it. He had stated it as a fact and moved on to other topics. But the fact was what he had noted. I visited Sutton in Hendersonville in January of 2026. We sat on his back porch with coffee. He showed me a photograph I had never seen. My father in his early 40s in dress uniform, standing at attention at some ceremony, expression on his face that I recognized because I see it in my own reflection on mornings when the work ahead requires everything I have. I took a photograph of the photograph on my phone. I look at it sometimes when I need a minute. Sutton's wife brought coffee from inside and set it on the porch table between us without joining the conversation, which I recognized as the particular social intelligence of someone who has spent decades knowing when to be present and when to leave room. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about a rotation they had shared in the early 90s, the specific dry competence my father had demonstrated in a situation Sutton could describe only in outline even 45 years later. He said my father was the kind of man whose presence in a team raised the team's competence, not through instruction or authority, but by simply operating at a level that made everyone around him operate at a similar level. I have heard the same thing said about women I admired in my own career, and I recognize it as one of the highest things that is possible to say about a professional. Before I left, Sutton went inside and came back with a challenge coin, Army Special Forces, 5th Group. He said my father had given it to him in 1993 and told him to hold it until he found someone it should belong to. He held it out across the porch table. I looked at it for a moment, then I picked it up. The metal was warm from his hand. I put it in my shirt pocket and kept it there for the drive back to the highway. I commissioned the granite bench in January through Yancey and the cemetery's memorial board. The inscription I wrote in one draft without revising it. He taught his daughter how to fix what was broken. The board asked if I wanted my name on the plaque. I said no. It was his bench. In February of 2026, Robert Yancey called me at NASIC on a Tuesday morning at 8:40. He told me Maribel's attorney had indicated his client would accept a plea. The terms, a guilty plea to financial exploitation of an at-risk adult, a Class H felony in North Carolina, restitution of $147,000 structured over 3 years, supervised release. I asked whether the felony conviction would be of permanent public record and whether the restitution agreement was legally enforceable. Yes, to both questions. I thanked him. The call lasted 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I finished the briefing I had been writing before the call came in. I told Dana Reeves the outcome in 2 words later that morning. She said, "Good." We went back to work. The house in Black Mountain closed on March 28, 2026. I was at my desk at NASIC when the real estate agent sent the confirmation text. I read it. I placed the phone face down on the desk. I finished the paragraph I had been writing, then I picked the phone up again and confirmed receipt of the agent's message. My father's house sold on a Friday morning while I was working. He would have found this the correct order of priorities. I drove down the Saturday before the closing, alone, the movers already gone, the rooms already empty and echoing with the specific hollow quality of spaces cleared of the things that gave them character. I walked through each room without hurrying, giving each one the attention it deserved before it became someone else's. The kitchen smelled like old wood and cleaning solution. The workshop still held faint paint smell from November. In the kitchen pantry, on the bottom shelf behind a box of nails that the movers had missed and that I had also missed in January, there was a small white envelope. Inside was a piece of Army-issue notepad paper, the small, slightly green-tinted paper that comes in military field pads, and that I recognized immediately because he had used it to leave notes on the kitchen counter my entire childhood whenever he left the house early. His handwriting was slightly cramped and deliberate, the compression of someone who learned to write under conditions where clarity mattered more than style. The note said, "No matter where you are, Eve, you were the mission." Below that, a dash and his name, dated November of 2024. The same month he had gone to see Yancey. The same month he had called me on a Sunday and told me about the cancer with the important information first. He was not a man who wrote things casually or for effect. He was precise with language because imprecision had consequences in every context he had ever operated in. And he never lost the habit. When he wrote that note and sealed it and placed it in the pantry where I would eventually find it, not at the funeral when I would have been too raw, but months later, when the year was mostly through and the hard parts were mostly handled, he meant it exactly as written. The way a master sergeant means things, completely, without decoration, not requiring acknowledgement to remain true. I sat there for a long time. The kitchen light through the pantry door threw a rectangle across the floor and moved incrementally along the linoleum. As the afternoon progressed, I watched it move the way you watch something when you have decided to stay until it tells you something. The pantry smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood. A specific combination of old wood and cardboard and the faint mineral smell of the concrete block foundation, and underneath everything, very faint, a trace of the vegetable soup my mother used to make in the large stock pot on cold weekends, which I know is purely something my memory has layered onto the actual smell. I read the note again. I turned the piece of paper over and confirmed the back was blank, that there was no additional writing I had missed. Then I folded it along its original crease and placed it in the inside pocket of my service coat, where it has been since. I thought about where he had placed it. Not on the kitchen counter where he normally left notes, not in the supply closet with the practical things, behind a box of nails he had known I would eventually find. In the pantry where my mother's recipe box was, where everything essential had always lived. He was precise with placement, the way he was precise with everything. Not by accident, but because he had thought about what the location would communicate and chosen accordingly. I sat on the kitchen floor with the note already in my coat and stayed there a while longer. The floor was cold and solid and level. He installed it himself in 2002, and I have no doubt it remains precisely level. It is maintained. On April 1st, 2026, I took the first flight from Dayton to Asheville and drove the 40 minutes to Black Mountain in a rental car, arriving at the cemetery while the dew was still on the grass. The morning was cool and clear, and the mountains were visible in the early light beyond the fence line. I was in my service dress, the dark blue coat, silver oak leaf clusters on both shoulders, 3 rows of ribbons above the left breast pocket, and I was the only one in uniform. The dedication group was small and the right size. Linda Mays, the cemetery director, who had coordinated the installation with evident care and efficiency. Gary Sutton and 2 of the other men from the 5th SFG in their good clothes and standing in the way they always stood. Robert Yancey, notebook open as always. The chaplain from the June service. A phone speaker on a folding table with a recording of America the Beautiful. Because there had not been time to arrange a live performance, and the recording was good enough that nobody mentioned it was a recording, Linda Mays spoke briefly about the Veterans Walkway program and my father's service. The chaplain offered a prayer. Then she pulled the velvet cloth from the plaque. The inscription in bronze letters, cut cleanly and precisely into the granite. He taught his daughter how to fix what was broken. Below it, his name, Joseph Allen Harlan, Master Sergeant, United States Army. 1952 to 2025. The branch insignia. Gary Sutton made a sound beside me. I placed my hand briefly on his arm. I had not cried since June 12th. Not in the parking lot at NASIC when Reeves told me. Not on the drive through West Virginia. Not on the workshop floor with the rubber-banded letters in my lap. Not in Hendersonville, looking at the photograph. Standing at the bench in the April morning light with the Blue Ridge perfectly still beyond the cemetery fence, reading those words in bronze above his name, I understood why the grief had held itself back for 9 months. Because grief is not a single event. It is a sequence of realizations arriving one at a time, and you cannot know which one will reach you or when. The realization that reached me at the bench was this. The inscription was completely and specifically true. He had taught me exactly that thing. Starting in a garage at 4 years old, in the flat and careful narration of a man explaining what a timing belt does to a child who couldn't reach the engine, continuing for 35 years without interruption, and the teaching had become indistinguishable from who I was. I cried for a short time with my hand on Gary Sutton's arm. Then I stopped and straightened, and the morning continued. Linda Mays came and stood beside me after a moment. She was a quiet woman with the particular economy of movement of someone who has worked in this space for many years, calibrated to the difference between mourners who want company and mourners who want witness. She said, "He's on the Veterans Walkway now. People come by every day who don't have anywhere particular to be. They stop and read the stones." I said that was good. She said the bench was the first on the path with a dedicated inscription rather than a standard memorial plate. I told her that seemed right for someone who believed the distinction between a thing and the explanation of that thing was always worth making explicit. She nodded once and moved away quietly, which was the correct thing to do. The group dispersed slowly, as small groups do when there is no particular reason to hurry. I walked the veterans' path alone for a while after the others moved toward the parking lot. Small flags planted along the graves for a recent memorial event turned lightly in the spring breeze. A groundskeeper worked at the far edge of the cemetery with the steady, careful pace of someone who takes their work seriously and requires no audience to do so. Birds moved through the oak trees at the perimeter. His headstone was visible from the bench, 50 feet across the grass, his name and dates already permanent in the granite. The stone records what can be recorded. It does not explain. The bench was for the explanation. Gary Sutton and I walked to the parking lot together. He asked if I was heading back to Ohio today. I said yes, the 6:45 from Asheville. He asked if I'd be back. I said when I could. He said that was the right answer. We shook hands the way his generation of soldiers shake hands, both hands, taking their time, meaning it fully. His grip was my father's grip, exactly, the same weight and the same deliberateness. And I noticed this and kept it to myself, because he already knew it. He said, "Your dad used to say the best thing you can do for someone you love is make sure they don't need you." I said my father was right about most things. Sutton said he was right about all of it. On the plane back to Dayton, I had a window seat on the left side of the aircraft, and when the plane banked north after takeoff, I could see the full sweep of the Appalachians below the left wing. The whole ridge in April morning light, enormous and permanent and exactly where it has always been and will continue to be. I watched it until the clouds came and covered it. Then I opened my laptop. The work was where I had left it. The flag from the funeral is on a shelf in my NASIC office now. In a glass case I had custom made in December, positioned where I can see it from my desk. The note from the pantry is folded in the inside pocket of my service coat, where it has been since March. His field compass, Army issue, still accurate after 40 years, is in my desk drawer. I keep it even though I always know where I am. I keep it because 40 years of accurate readings are worth carrying, and because it was his, and because it still works. My father spent 30 years serving something larger than himself. He never made a production of it. He showed up, did what needed doing, came home, and then, when home became something that required protecting, he built a record and gave it to a lawyer and put a note in a pantry where his daughter would eventually find it. The work I do doesn't look like his, but the principle is identical. You show up, you do what you were trained to do. You make sure that when your part is finished, the mission continues. I think that's what the note was saying. I think that's what the bench says. And I think that's enough. If you've ever had someone try to take from you the things that were most yours, not through force, but through patience and paperwork and the quiet assumption that no one was keeping records, then you already understand why none of this was ever about the flag. The flag was the proof. He was always the point. My father filed that letter 11 months before he died. He never mentioned it to me. He just made sure I was protected when the moment arrived. Copies with his attorney, with the funeral home, with the Army Casualty Office at Fort Knox. 3 locations. Because that's how he operated. Quietly, precisely, without announcement, without any expectation of being acknowledged for it. And what I've come to understand from the other side of all of it is that the people who love you correctly don't make a production of it. They just build the record and trust you to find it. If you have someone like that in your life, someone who shows up without making noise about having shown up, tell them you see it. Don't wait for the right moment. It costs you almost nothing, and it might mean everything to them. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.